Good evening and welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in tonight. My name is Kate Bruns, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am very pleased to introduce tonight's talk with George Makari, presenting his latest book, Of Fear and Strangers, A History of Xenophobia, joined in conversation by Anthony Walton. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our now ever expanding digital community. We host virtual events like tonight's 5 or more times a week. You can find our event schedule on our website at harvard.com/events, where you can sign up for our email newsletter or browse our bookshelves from home. This evening's event is going to conclude with some time for your questions. If you would like to ask our speakers anything during the event, please go to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen where you can ask a question. We're going to get through as many as time allows for this evening. Also a reminder that if you would like closed captions, you can click the live transcript tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen. In just a moment, I'm going to be posting the link to purchase tonight's featured book, Of Fear and Strangers, in the chat box. Your book purchases really do make virtual author events like this possible. And now more than ever, they support the future of a landmark local independent bookstore. So thank you for tuning in during these strange virtual times. We really sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you have likely experienced during virtual gatherings, technical issues can arise. And if they do, I'm going to do my best to resolve them quickly. So thank you so much for your patience and your understanding. And now I'm very pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. Dr. George Makari is a psychoanalyst, professor, historian, and award-winning writer. His previous books are Soul Machine, The Invention of the Modern Mind, a 2015 Guardian Best Book of the Year, and Revolution in Mind, The Creation of Psychoanalysis. On top of his writing books and essays, he's the director of the DeWitt Wallace Institute, professor of psychiatry at Weill Cornell Medical College, and adjunct professor at both Rockefeller University and Columbia University Center for Psychoanalytic Training and Research. Tonight, he is joined in conversation by acclaimed writer and poet Anthony Walton, the author of Mississippi and American Journey, co-editor of Every Shut-Eye Ain't Asleep, and co-editor of the Vintage Book of African American Poetry. His work has earned him a Whiting Award, and he currently teaches and is senior writer-in-residence at Bowdoin College. Tonight, the two are discussing George's latest book, Of Fear and Strangers, which chronicles the rise of xenophobia from its popularization and misuse to its spread as an ethical principle and its sudden reappearance in the 21st century. The book has been hailed as a, quote, illuminating, timely, and thorough investigation of a cultural plague. And Anthony Walton himself writes of it, in an epoch where nations often appear cleaved into equally disdainful mobs, Makari makes an airtight case that an enhanced understanding of the concept xenophobia can serve as a skeleton key that will unlock many of the psychic terrors currently haunting our cognitive processes and social worlds. We are so pleased to be hosting this event tonight. So without further ado, Anthony and George, the digital podium is yours.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much, Kate. Well, Doctor, I thought I would begin by asking you, the title of your book is Of Fear and Strangers, A History of Xenophobia. Now, I think xenophobia is a word that we hear a lot these days, but I would argue that we often don't really consider in a deep fashion what it is, what it means. The word has many resonances and overtones throughout the world, often differently in different places. So can you give us a quick etymology of the term, as well as what it means to you, that can serve as a frame for our discussion?
Well, that's a great question, and I'm afraid my answer can't be that quick because, in fact, finding out the etymology and then the deployment of the term was this kind of fascinating voyage of discovery. I had thought, like everyone else, that the term was from antiquity, and xenos is a Greek word from antiquity that is a complicated word that means both stranger and guest. Phobos means fear. Everyone thought it was in, a number of textbooks that this was a word discovered in antiquity. When I found out that that was not true, that led to this kind of search, this hunt, if you will, for precisely the kind of clarity that you want me to give you and that I searched for. And it turns out that clarity isn't really so easy to find, because the term starts off in the late 19th century and has a couple of, false starts. One in medicine as one of the phobias, another for ultranationalism. But then the really shocking thing that emerged was that if you want the moment that the term really went viral, it was in the context of colonialism and racism, where it was used in a racist way to say Eastern primitive people were inferior and therefore had a biologic xenophobia. So this, made the hunt even more fascinating to find out how did that thing then double back upon itself. And I argue that xenophobia today, to cut more to the present, is a really important term to think about a number of groups that have been victimized by stranger fear and hatred. And that we have a way of thinking about a commonality between racism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, homophobia. If we think about this other concept that doesn't name the victims, it names a process in the victimizers. So that's really what I tried to consolidate in the first half of the book. And, it was really a complex story, but ultimately really edifying for me.
Okay. Now, the book had a personal resonance for you as well. I'm thinking particularly of the way the book opens, talking about your family and your Lebanese heritage and the expansion of your family into the United States. Now, can you tell us a bit about how that led you to this subject and ultimately this book, and if there are other things you wish to comment on out of that section of the book, please feel free.
Yeah, well, Anthony, it would make sense that that would have led me to the book, but in fact, the book led me to my heritage. In other words, I started off in a way thinking that after Soul Machine, I was really interested in this really bread and butter question for psychiatrists about how one mind knows another and how we misknow each other. And it wasn't really that socially and politically engaged until I started to recognize that the xenophobia thing that was exploding around Europe and then in the States made sense as a political context, a downstream effect maybe of some of the things I was thinking about psychologically. And it was only then really, and it's the writing process where, the part of me, the writerly conscience said, wait a minute, you can't write this book without writing about yourself. You are the son of two Lebanese immigrants. And so in a way, it was a lifetime of reading that reminded me, hey, wait a minute, you're missing something here. And that, was, this part of me that was, kind of left behind a bit because I am, a super assimilated American in a lot of ways. And so it was a very meaningful process to remember that not only was immigration part of my life story, but a nation state that breaks down in extraordinary sectarian hatred and violence was also part of my life story, because that's what happened to Lebanon when I was 14, 15 years old. And that lasted for much of my early adult life. And well, let's hope it doesn't come back, but it's been a simmering issue ever since.
Well, can you talk a little bit more about what happened in Lebanon and how you experienced that as a young person? I mean, it's interesting because Lebanon was a place that functioned for many years, perhaps centuries, and then suddenly it fell apart.
Yeah.
It's the sort of thing, and we'll talk about this more in a moment, that, it's not unreasonable to think about in terms of our country.
Yeah. Yeah, that what happened in Lebanon is, really complex story. And I'll tell you, from my eyes, the eyes of a child, my grandfather had come to the United States, and then he went back to Lebanon really to get rugs. He had become he'd worked himself up to be a Oriental rug dealer, got trapped in World War I, so he never left. So then my parents grew up, one under French education, the other under American and English education. In other words, colonialism and World War I were not distant from our history. They were defining elements of our history. My mother spoke beautiful French. My father did not. My father spoke beautiful English. My mother, after years, spoke better English, but he was, eloquent, and she was eloquent in different colonial languages, which they loved. We went every summer, and the last summer we went, through a child's eyes, I saw the burning tires, I saw the AK-47s, I saw the kafiyas, and I did not understand what was happening. Through a child's eyes, we just left that summer, and that was the summer just before everything blew up, with this premonition that we might not be going back for a long time. And then, in fact, this war broke out, which started out as a war between the PLO and Christian militias, but then splintered into this war where many different militias and many different, ideologies all had their armies, and it was a kind of communal slaughter. That became very resonant to me. My aunt was murdered. My cousins fled the country if they could get out. We tried to help some of them. So this was all stuff I had left behind in New Jersey, where I grew up. And as I made my way in the world, and Anthony, that you and I had the same mentor at Brown, the great poet Michael Harper, who challenged me about this and said, in a way that was very, very meaningful, looking at my poems, where is your history? There was no history in them. So that moment came back to me as I was writing this book many, many years later. And I thought, okay, this is a moment where this is part of this story. This is a part of the story that you need to tell. And so, really the book became like a three-legged stool. I wanted to focus on the deep history of this term, something about the present, although I knew historians don't solve the problems of the present, but something I didn't want to ignore, what can we do about this now? And I had to tell a personal story too. So those were the three legs of the stool that I put together in the structure of this book.
Okay, well, it's fascinating to me because that is a moment in history when neighbors began to see themselves as strangers, which is something that we see again and again. We see that in Northern Ireland. We see that starting to happen in Hungary, for example. So that's one of my fascinations with your book, that it helped me think about these kinds of landscapes and what is going on, and how fragile often our relationships or accommodations are. Now, a more kind of, general way of thinking about this, one of the clear theses of your book is that these tendencies are something that all of us wrestle with. It's not just saying, well, those people do this and it's their problem. They're the ones creating this problem. So I wonder if you'd talk about for a moment what it is that you see that's in all of us that cause us to be susceptible to xenophobia.
Yes. So, coming upon that historical moment where I saw xenophobia became popular as a xenophobic term, it was used xenophobically, alerted me to, hey, don't become the mirror image of the thing, of the other. Don't, you can't do the same thing you say they're doing to you. And so how do we avoid that? How do we penetrate more deeply into what the problem is? And, at the time, when xenophobia was really starting to become part of the general discussion, there really were these two arguments that had nothing to do with psychology. One was a kind of rational economic actor argument. It was that these people from North Africa, from Syria into Europe especially, were flooding the market and lowering wages. And it was just a straight up argument about, either economic deprivation, 2008 and the collapse, all economic arguments. And what I said was, look, helplessness is a big part of this problem, but not every migrant situation ends up in xenophobia. Hardly. That's how countries grow. And not every downturn in an economy ends up in xenophobia. Sure, it makes a lot of people feel helpless, but that's just a risk factor. So what I ended up arguing was like those rational arguments, that what I call the economic argument and the cultural invasion argument, the sociologists who've done research show they do not hold for these events. And I started to zoom in on what I say are the three core elements, the three heads of this serpent. One is there is a fragility in identity, xenos. It is about who is us and who is them. There is an issue about fear and helplessness and rage. There is an affective quality. That's the phobos part. And then the third is all of these elements have to combine, have something to do with groups. We know that xenophobia is something that takes over groups. It's not just an individual problem. So I started to say, hey, look, if we're going to think seriously about this and think about it without just othering the people who are doing it, we have to think very specifically about these three elements and what are causal in these three elements to try to then attack the problem.
Okay, well, to push a little further into that then, how are stereotypes formed? I mean, you talk about there's an individual aspect of this, and then there is a group aspect of this.
Yeah.
Something that ties those two factors together would be this idea of stereotypes.
Yes.
So how would you explain to us?
Yeah, stereotypes is a very clean and simple model that explains a certain amount of the problem. It's, fascinating because it was taken from printing, the term, and it is these kind of coins that we have for fast thinking, as Daniel Kahneman would say. And we all have them. But what happens when there's very negative and about a minority, an outgroup, an immigrant group? They can frequently not just be passively taken in, which is the interestingly simple problem. Passive learning of stereotypes should be relatively easy to correct. But what if they're taken in and then become part of group identity? Now it's not so easy to shake them. So stereotypes on the face of it should be amenable to relearning, re-education. We show kids movies of the Holocaust. We teach them about slavery. Hollywood tries to a certain extent to, not always successfully, but they try to undermine, or at least they have in recent years, the stereotypes. But what about when that stereotype is valued because it gives group identity? Now it becomes stickier. So there's two problems in stereotype. One, the easy one, re-educate, teach the kids. The other, the stickier one, what if that stereotype is part of a stickier group identity?
Okay. That leads us in an interesting way to, can you comment on what has happened in places like Hungary, Poland, Turkey, Brazil, even England, and even here, especially in the United States?
Yeah.
How xenophobia can be and has been weaponized into political movements around the world.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because it happens in all these quite different contexts. That's one of the things very interesting to me about this. So increasingly, nations often appear cleaved into equally disdainful mobs.
Yes.
So why is this? do you think? And following on some of your comments about stereotype, is there anything we can do about it?
Yeah. Wow, those are big questions, and they're tough ones really for a historian to answer because they do involve a lot of the history of the present. But what I would say is the historical moment where xenophobia gets coined and goes viral has a lot of parallels with our moment. It is after 25, 30, maybe 40 years of extraordinarily rapid globalization, empowered by technology, and globalization that was fundamentally asymmetric. It was about Europeans conquering as much as they could of Asia and Africa. That was the context for the first coining of xenophobia in which it went viral. I think we're living in a similar moment where we live maybe now in a globalized world that's digitally weaponized, that has a lot of flattening and coming together of foreign tribes, and that puts a lot of pressure on people's identity. So I couldn't comment, I'm not an expert on all of the countries that you named, but the example that I found really encouraging and worthy of underlining, especially since the EU has been attacked a lot, is if you trace the notion of xenophobia, it takes off around 1990. It's a kind of backwaters notion. Racism is important. Homophobia starts to be important. Other problems, social problems that name the victims are important. And then suddenly you see this upsurge around 1990. And I argue that the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War created havoc, essentially, in a lot of people's identities, first in Eastern Europe, but also in the United States, where some people were deeply committed to be Cold Warriors. So what do you do if you're a Cold Warrior without a Cold War? And what do you do if you're used to living in the greatest country in the world, the people who defeated the Nazis? And remember, that was the Soviet Union also. They were deeply committed to being anti-Nazis and celebrated their defeat of the Nazis. When that whole thing crumbles, and it was a very fraught moment where what they called a new xenophobia emerged in Europe. And I think the European Union saved countless lives. Why? Each of these little new nations had battles between ultranationalists who were going to do what ultranationalists do, which is to find some outsider group, outsider nationality to unite themselves, versus European globalists. And who knows how that wouldn't have gone without the EU offering entry into with democratic principles as a prerequisite. So country after country in Eastern Europe decided, hey man, we want to be in the EU. And they outflanked those ultranationalists who I think you can't prove a negative, but I think you can conjecture there would have been a lot more Yugoslavias and a lot more bloodshed. So we're in a very confusing moment right now. I don't have the answers for exactly why this is happening in so many places, but what I try to do is become clearer about what the problem is so that other experts who know Poland better than I do can maybe have tools to work through what's happening in Poland.
Okay, well, thank you for that answer. And I don't want to put you on the spot yet again as a historian, but I'm going to because I want to ask you a little more about the United States. And I have a way of framing the question that I hope will allow you to focus in the ways that you feel comfortable as a historian in speaking about the present.
Yeah.
Now, how do you see xenophobia in the lens of the past, let's say, as affecting specifically the United States at this time? Now, I often think of the US as afflicted with at least, and I'm going to underscore that at least, in order to keep it simple for the sake of this discussion, or as simple as we can, two sorts of racism in this context. Now, there is the kind of inbred, shall we say, structural racism against the classic internal members of society who are considered out groups and whose subjugation was necessitated by, in my view, I'm not attributing this to you, but in my view, the, shall we say, desires of the system. So we're talking about long-standing minorities, indigenous, Blacks, Latinos, Asians. Then there's a kind of racism, on the other hand, that manifests itself more clearly in the ways that our country treats and regards, I think, immigrants of color. So you see two different things
Yeah,
and maybe two different manifestations of xenophobia.
right.
And I also want to say, I think it's safe to say that only immigrants of color are treated this way, as we see with what happened last week with the Haitians in Texas. So do you think there's any way out of this current malaise, which seems to be going backwards in the sense of our nation and some of the progress we had
Yeah.
felt that we were making?
Yeah, so in a way, it's two questions, and the last part I'll take first. Like I wrote this book because I have kids, one of whom better be on this, better be in the audience right now. Hi, Gabby. And because it is an act of hope to try to figure out how we can more effectively manage these problems. Absolutely, I think despair, we can't afford despair. We need to be clearer about what we're doing, not have straw man arguments that divide good people from each other, and go forward. Now, to do that, as you say, we need to think about maybe some of the differences that you're talking about, which I think are historically specific. And I'm a historian, so I'm all about historical specificity. I would not for a second argue that those two groups that you categorized were the same, nor would I argue that even some of the people you mentioned within each of those categories are the same. So, people of color, are Italians people of color? Because at one point they were, and so I would say that those are really good questions that a lot of historians have mapped out. For instance, how Asians and the history of anti-Asian bias in the United States, how that worked, what the power structures were, what the structural racist methods were. All of that stuff is very specific and beyond really my book. My book is about saying, hey, those things are really important, but there's another thing that's important. A lot of sociology shows the people who hate the Blacks, hate the Asians, hate the Jews. And there's this wonderful quote by Frantz Fanon that I found both wonderful and despairing in a way, to go to your point. He gets to Algeria, and he's from Martinique and Black. And he writes this line: the French hate the Jews who hate the Arabs who hate the Blacks. And I just could see that. Well, he stopped there, but the circle just could keep going round and round. And so part of the project of my book is to say, yes, there are specificities. And I'm sure you're right that the way that new immigrants of color are treated from, say, Haiti are different from old African-American families who have been here for 400 years. And that those differences are really important for us to understand the complex country that we live in. And yet, maybe our tools for understanding what goes on in the hater are common, will give us access to not just everything is different, but some of this is driven by some of the same forces. Xenophobia is unlike these other terms in that it focuses on the victimizer, not the victims. And so I would say your question is a fabulous one. It's a one that people could write lots of books about, and I'm sure, and you're in the middle of writing one right now. But that's my tack, was to say, okay, what are the commonalities? Because that gives us some access to both potentially something to do about a bunch of things. And secondarily, it stops the Ferris wheel of hatred. You can't just have your group that you're cool with, but then you're like just as bigoted about some other group. You got to see the whole wheel. And that's how we're going to progress as a country and as a culture.
Okay, well, thank you for that answer. Now, there's a couple more things that I want to get to before we go to the questions from those who've joined us.
Please.
First of all, to take our conversation in a little different direction, there are also something I love about this book is that you do point at many of the heroes, the people who have valiantly stood up against xenophobia and other problems. To just name one, I'd like to hear you briefly say something about Lemkin. Would you tell us a little about him?
Yeah, well, can I just say a little bit about the first part of your question? I thought it was
Sure.
really, it was important. It was empowering. It was encouraging to realize that there was this tradition. It was a minority tradition, but it was a tradition of people who stood up to their own people, to their own nations, to their own culture, and said no. And that interestingly, the people inside that tradition knew about each other. They cited each other. And so I started with Bartholomew de las Casas, the great and noble, a man who saw what was happening in New Spain and decried it to his own country, who then is spoken of by Joseph Conrad when he sees Roger Casement, who's come back from Congo and the genocide in the Congo, and he says, Casement is a new Las Casas. And then it goes from there to Lemkin, who is a Polish jurist who is Jewish, who ends up losing, I can't remember if it was 41 or 43 members of his family to the Holocaust. He gets out and he's a bit of a linguist and a lawyer, and he starts to advocate for some sort of international law that will name what countries do to their own minorities. There was no term for it. It wasn't a war crime because there was no war against another nation. And so he coined the term genocide. And he looked to a whole tradition, Las Casas, and a bunch of other people. They took strength from seeing other folks did this before. And I wanted to highlight that tradition because we all need to be as brave as we can and be a little bit of Lemkin, a little bit of Las Casas. That's what we all need to do because we're facing a big problem in this country.
Okay. Well, before we move into our Q&A, and I encourage our viewers that if you have a question, please submit it. If you look to the right side of the screen, you will see on the bottom an icon for Q&A. If you click on that, you can submit a question that if we have time, I will do my best to present to Dr. Makari. But before we do that, I'd like to ask you, please, George, to read a portion from the book so that we can hear.
Thank you, Anthony. All right, I'm gonna just read the last few paragraphs of the book, the very end of the book. And the very end of the book, I had finished essentially writing the book. And there's a framing narrator. So the prologue is my story and my family's story. And I come back to that first person voice at the end in the coda, which is takes place in a rural French village where my wife grew up, where we go in the summers. It's in the Pyrenees. And it is very much a land of refugees and people who are crossing borders. It's right on the border with Spain. Many people in our village were descended from refugees from Franco. When we first went there, I'm that old, I met these folks. And this was a pathway that first, helped people fleeing Franco flee into France. And then just a few years later was the same mountain crossing that Jews used to flee the Nazis. It's become a bit of a deal because it's the path that Walter Benjamin took, one of my heroes, a great writer, who took this path, lugging a little suitcase, even though he was very, very out of shape. And as he tried to cross, the other folks said, you know, this is crazy. You've got to drop this suitcase. And he said, there's a manuscript in this that's more important than my life. Walter Benjamin got caught at the border. And while he was awaiting deportation to the Gestapo, committed suicide. So this is the end of my book. The story of Walter Benjamin's flight is famous, and it has long haunted me. Did this brilliant wanderer, this European flaneur, know that in the end he would become mythic as a man on the run, a Xenos turned away, crushed by cool legalisms enforced at foreign ports and borders? In his final despair, did he know his story would be rewritten backward so that this hike would become a tourist destination and his spirit would forever linger in dingy Portbou? And what of his briefcase? What was in it? Many have speculated, but I think the simplest answer is hope. That leather bag contained Walter Benjamin's last appeal. It was what remained of a trembling, failing trust that perhaps his voice might vault over the highest walls of hatred to reach far off, perhaps quite foreign beings who might join with him over those pages. Sometimes I imagine that if one stumbled upon that dusty valise and pried it open, as in the 1001 Nights, it would release the roaring voices of history's refugees and exiles, all their lamentations, their laughter and their stories, all their accusations and confessions, all freed from oblivion together in a waterfall of sound so grand, so sublime, that for an instant it would stop everything, even time. History is a trip into the spirit world. It is an attempt to wake the graveyard and give our ancestors voice and form so that we can confront them and free ourselves from their spells. History, at its best then, contains the hope not only of resurrection, but of exorcism. It holds the desire that by remembering, we will not repeat. Of Fear and Strangers has been my attempt to remember for myself, for you. Xenophobia is not some antiquated classical term. It is our word. We have a name for what is happening to us, what has been growing in scope, flashing red, spreading. The only questions are how extreme will it become? What forms will it take? Who will it target? And who will stand to oppose it? This hatred will not end of its own accord. This is our catastrophe. That poet who once grilled me about my history, himself descended from enslaved people, wrote that, quote, nightmare begins responsibility. That responsibility, I know now, to ourselves, to each other, is not just to wake up, but to remember it all when we do. Thank you.
Okay, beautiful. And I'll add to that that is just indicative of the sorts of writing that are in this book. One of the things that I think is kind of just so nurturing about your work as a writer, and I would include all three of your books in this, as well as other things you have written, is your ability to combine this just kind of amazing learnedness with that sort of just skilled and easeful writing as a writer. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Anthony.
Now,
Thank you, man.
yes, to move into some of the questions from those who've joined us this evening. We have an interesting question that I think is a valid one. you give a great deal of praise to Bartolomé de las Casas. You've mentioned him in our conversation this evening, and
Yeah.
you talk about him in the book. He's someone that also I'm aware of, having had a rigorous Catholic education. So someone that was pointed to me again and again.
Yeah.
So our audience member would like to know, why do you show admiration of De las Casas? He was a land and slave owner, as well as, many other things. So would you
Yeah.
comment about what
Yeah.
it is that you see in him that's so important?
Yeah, no, the question is absolutely correct. Las Casas, his father came back from one of Columbus's journeys. The father's gift was a black slave. Las Casas was very eager to get involved, and he went over to colonize as well. He became a landowner, and they didn't call it slavery, but it really was slavery. It was supposed to be one step below. It was effectively slavery. But what happened to Las Casas is he had an awakening, and he is probably after the slaughter of some Taino Indians. No one's exactly sure why, but he renounced slavery. He abandoned his lands. He went back and took Dominican orders. And then after a rather lengthy time, actually, it didn't happen overnight, I think it was 6 years, he emerged as a moral voice that denounced exactly what he had done. And then he was unrelenting, and then he was utterly brave. I mean, this was during the Inquisition, and it's extraordinary that he got away with it, because there was a certain amount of fear about writing against what the Spanish Empire had become. And honestly, the questioner doesn't ask the worst question, because the worst question is, at one point, Las Casas, out of fear that all the Indians were dying, and out of a deluded notion that Africans would survive the conditions better, told the queen that she should import Africans to make and let the Indians be. And again, he repented. He said this is one of the worst things he's ever done, probably unforgivable by God. So this isn't a perfect man, and none of us are perfect. But this is a man with a strong conscience and with a clarity that he would come to only after failing. I think it's worthy of a great deal of admiration.
Okay. Our next question. Now, one of my thoughts, and something I've said in writing about the book, is that I see it as our understanding of the concept of xenophobia can serve as a kind of skeleton key to being able to have a wider understanding, deeper perception of what's going on now. And so
Yeah.
that's my metaphor.
Yeah.
Now, building on that, we have a question about, could you speak more to the benefit of understanding xenophobia's origins? And I think this, moves into your wheelhouse as a historian. How can, in understanding it historically, help us now understanding the origins?
Yeah. Well, look, words are a lot of things, but one thing they're tools, and they do things. And when we misuse them, or if they become bloated and they become rather useless. So part of this exercise was to try to purify, clarify, and repurpose, in a way, a term that, as Anthony said, is like a kind of add-on. You'd say, well, I'm against racism and sexism and anti-Semitism, and then maybe the person adds in xenophobia. and it wasn't really even clear what it meant. In fact, the UN didn't want to use the term because they thought it was too vague, and the terms that name the threatened groups were clearer. But I argue that that's actually exactly why, if we have a clear notion of what it means to be xenophobic, it becomes a super powerful tool. And that becomes clear as we see the misuses, and then the way it locks in these Western cultures, thinking about their bigotry against immigrants and minorities, both of them, and how xenos, the idea of making these people strange, making them other, is driven both by, and ever since, you know, the experiments on fight or flight, fear and rage. We know the two are connected, right? Under threat, fight or flight. And so threat and the making of another into a stranger, that becomes a useful tool if we can understand how that happens individually and socially, for trying to prevent this from happening and arrest it as it emerges. Does that answer the question?
Yes, yes, thank you. We have time for one more question, which is again going to be a question that, as a historian, I think you might reflexively resist, but I feel coming at it from my perspective and from the perspective of our audience member, I think is important. And it's particularly important now in the United States. And I think that it's a kind of question that, in particular, if we try to figure out ways to work together on both sides of the spectrum in our country, the United States, is the sort of thing that needs to be addressed. So do your best, please. But
That's quite an intro. Go ahead.
sure. Well, you know, whenever we're arguing, I like to try and outflank you. Now, suppose you're the president of the United States. How do you make a distinction between protecting the country from legitimate problems, such as our audience member asked, Chinese, Russian threats, terrorist threats, and a myriad of other problems that we are just facing every day? And you just turn on the evening news and suddenly, you know, whether it's the illegal immigration or migrant issues, all of these things, how do we legitimately deal with those kinds of threats? I think including just describing them, how do we keep that from becoming or us being xenophobic? So we'll finish with that.
I think that's a great question, and I think you know, there's a number of answers in the book, but the one that immediately comes to mind for me is that to be American is about believing in core ideas that are still imperfect and unachieved, but they're core ideas, you know, and that's what brings all these immigrants together. And so I don't think we have to be abashed about defending those ideas, about having borders just like any other nation. And when we oppose, we should oppose other ideas. I have no problem opposing authoritarian countries. I'm an anti-authoritarian. If you tell me I'm being racist by opposing what's happened in China, especially in the last 5 years, I will deny that. And I will say I'm actually anti-authoritarian. It's an ideal, it's an idea. And am I against the Chinese people? Absolutely not. I'm against the Chinese government. That is a perfectly reasonable and important moral distinction. I am not against a whole people. A whole people don't have the access to power to make decisions about war or peace. And so, you know, am I against Russians in general? Of course not. Why would I be against Russians in general when I'm actually very disturbed by the rise of authoritarianism in Russia. And those are ideals that as a democratic nation, we need to oppose there and at home. So I would say the clarity here is about not being against a racial group, an ethnic group, or even a whole nation state, but being very clear that you can and must oppose, not can, but should and must oppose things that undermine the best ideals of being American. And if you do that abroad, you know what? You should do it at home too, because we have those problems here.
Okay. Thank you. George, it's been a pleasure talking with you and listening, being able to kind of take part and even sup from your erudition and the clarity of your thinking. And thank you so much for being with us this evening. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Anthony. It was wonderful to talk to you, and it was wonderful to talk to the folks at the Harvard Bookstore. Thank you for that wonderful independent bookstore that you have. I'm honored and delighted to have had this opportunity. I only wish I could go out for a drink right now with all of you. So thanks very much.
Agreed. Well, thank you both for that tremendous talk, just adding on to the thank yous. In particular, what a lovely audience Q&A portion. Thank you to our audience members out there watching tonight for submitting such thoughtful kind of conversation provoking questions. So to end this out, on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, have a great night, everyone. Please keep reading, check out the links that I put in the chat, and stay healthy. Thank you.
Thanks very much.